For the first 2 years of their marriage, Brian and Lydia lived a simple but beautiful life. They did not have a huge house. They did not drive expensive cars. They did not spend their weekends in expensive restaurants or luxury hotels. But they had something money could not easily buy: peace. Every morning, Lydia woke before sunrise. She prepared breakfast while Brian got ready for work. Sometimes, they sat together for a few minutes before Brian left. "Have a good day," Lydia would tell him. "Take care of yourself," Brian would reply. And before leaving, he would often smile and say, "I'll be home early." Those words meant everything to Lydia. Their home was modest, but it was filled with laughter. On weekends, they attended church together. Sometimes they visited family. Other times, they simply stayed home, cooked together, watched movies, and talked about their future. They had dreams. Brian wanted to become a successful businessman. Lydia dreamed of opening her own grocery shop one day. "We'll get there," Brian often told her. And Lydia believed him. She believed in her husband completely. But then something happened that neither of them expected. Brian's career began to rise. One Monday morning, Brian was called into his manager's office. He had no idea why. As he walked through the office corridor, several colleagues watched him curiously. "Brian, the boss wants to see you," one of them whispered. Brian entered the office. His manager was standing beside the window with a large smile. "Brian, sit down." Brian sat. The manager opened a file. "You've been one of our most reliable employees," he said. Brian smiled nervously. "Thank you, sir." "We've been watching your performance for some time." Manager paused. "I'm pleased to inform you that you've been promoted." Brian's eyes widened. "Promoted?" "Yes. The new position came with a much larger salary, a better office, and a company vehicle." Brian could hardly believe it. When he returned home that evening, Lydia immediately noticed something different about him. "You look happy," she said. Brian placed his briefcase down. "Lydia." "Yes, I got promoted." Lydia screamed with excitement. "Brian!" She rushed toward him and hugged him. "I knew you could do it." Brian laughed. They celebrated with a simple dinner. Lydia cooked his favorite meal. They sat together at the table, laughing and talking about their future. That night, Brian looked at his wife and said, "Soon we'll have everything we've dreamed about." Lydia smiled. "As long as we have each other." Brian nodded. At that moment, he meant it. But success has a strange way of changing people. Sometimes it doesn't change who you are. It simply reveals who you are becoming. With his promotion came new responsibilities. Brian began attending meetings with senior managers and wealthy clients. His new colleagues dressed differently. They drove expensive cars, they ate at expensive restaurants, and they spent their evenings in fashionable clubs. At first, Brian only joined them occasionally. One Friday afternoon, a colleague named Kevin approached him. "Brian, we're going out tonight." Brian looked at his watch. "I should probably go home." Kevin laughed. "Come on, man, you're a manager now. You can't keep living like a student." Colleague joined them. "You've been working hard. You deserve to enjoy yourself." Brian hesitated, then his phone rang. It was Lydia. "Hello, are you coming home soon?" she asked. "Probably." "Should I wait for dinner?" Brian looked at his colleagues. "Don't wait, I'll eat something on the way." Lydia went quiet. "'Kay." Brian ended the call. Kevin smiled. "Come on." That evening, Brian entered the club. The music was loud. The lights flashed across the room. People were laughing and dancing. Brian felt uncomfortable at first. But after a few hours, he began enjoying himself. For the first time, he felt like he belonged to a different world. A world of expensive drinks, beautiful outfits, luxury cars, and endless parties. When he finally returned home, it was nearly 2 in the morning. Lydia was still awake. She sat quietly in the living room. "You're home," she said. Brian dropped his keys onto the table. "Yeah." "Did you have a good time?" "Yes." Lydia looked at him. "I was worried." Brian sighed. "Lydia, I'm not a child." "I know. Then stop worrying every time I go somewhere." She lowered her eyes. "I wasn't trying to control you." "Good." Brian walked into the bedroom. Lydia remained sitting alone. That night something changed, not dramatically, not loudly, but quietly. A small crack had appeared in their marriage. The following weekend, Brian went out again, then the weekend after that. Soon, Friday nights became Saturday mornings. Saturday nights became Sunday mornings. And eventually, Brian began finding reasons to go out even during the week. "There's a company dinner. There's a client meeting. And with some colleagues. Don't wait for me." Lydia tried to understand. She reminded herself that Brian was successful now. She told herself that his work required networking. But eventually the excuses became too many. One evening, Lydia called him. No answer. She called again. Still nothing. At 1:30 a.m., Brian finally answered. Hello, Brian, where are you? Mout. Where? He became irritated. Why do you need to know everything? I've been calling you for hours. I was busy. Can you please come home? I'll come when I'm ready. Phone went silent. Lydia sat on the edge of their bed. She stared at the wedding photograph on the wall. In the photograph, Brian was smiling at her as if she were the only person in the world. She remembered his wedding vows. She remembered his promises. And she wondered where that man had gone. Brian's new friends introduced him to different social circles. There were women everywhere. They complimented him. They laughed at his jokes. They admired his expensive clothes and company car. Brian enjoyed the attention. At first, he told himself it was harmless. He would say, I'm just having fun. Gradually, the boundaries disappeared. He began flirting. He exchanged phone numbers. He started receiving messages late at night. Sometimes Lydia would see his phone lighting up. Who is that? She once asked. Someone from work. Work? Yes, she didn't argue, she trusted him. But trust can become painful when it is repeatedly tested. One Saturday night, Brian posted photographs from a nightclub. He was surrounded by several women. The caption read, Living my best life. Lydia saw the post. She stared at the screen for several seconds. Then she placed her phone down. She didn't cry immediately. Instead, she went into the kitchen. She prepared dinner. She set 2 plates on the table, and she waited. Hours passed. Brian didn't come home. Eventually, Lydia removed his plate. She sat alone. The food grew cold, so did her heart. People began noticing. Neighbors who once admired Brian and Lydia's marriage started asking questions. One afternoon, Lydia was outside hanging clothes when her neighbor, Mama Rose, approached. Everything okay? Lydia smiled. Everything is fine. Mama Rose looked at her carefully. You don't look fine. Lydia laughed softly. I'm just tired. Mama Rose knew sometimes people say they're tired when they're actually heartbroken. Lydia didn't want the neighbors talking. She didn't want Brian's reputation damaged. She didn't want her family worrying, so she kept everything inside. She continued preparing his meals. She continued keeping the house clean. She continued supporting him. And every time Brian came home late, she hoped the next day would be different. But it wasn't. Brian gradually stopped noticing the things Lydia did for him. He stopped thanking her. He stopped asking about her day. He stopped noticing when she was sad. One morning, Lydia prepared breakfast. Brian, your tea is ready. Walked past the table. I don't have time. I made your favorite breakfast. I'm already late. Grabbed his keys. Lydia followed him to the door. We talked tonight. About what? About us. Brian sighed. Not now. Don't know. Then he walked away. Lydia watched the car disappear. She stood at the gate for several minutes. She had never imagined marriage could feel this lonely. One evening, Lydia called Brian again. This time, he answered. What? Brian, please come home. Why? I need to talk to you. I'm busy. Please. Was silence. Then Brian said, Lydia, you're making this difficult. She swallowed hard. Your wife. I know. Then why do I feel like I'm living alone? Brian became silent. For a moment, Lydia thought he might finally understand. But instead he said, I'll come home later. The call ended. Lydia placed the phone on the table. She looked around their living room. Their wedding photograph stood on the shelf. She walked toward it. She picked it up, her eyes filled with tears. How did we get here? She whispered. A few days later, Lydia finally confronted Brian. He had returned home late again. Brian, we need to talk. I'm tired. So am I. He looked at her. What do you want? I want my husband back. Brian laughed bitterly. I'm right here. No, Lydia said quietly. You're not. Brian frowned. You've changed. Changed too, he replied. I changed because you stopped caring. Work hard for this family. Family? Brian looked at her. Lydia's voice trembled. You don't spend time with me anymore. You don't call. You don't come home. You're always with other women. We go again. I'm not accusing you. I'm telling you how I feel. Brian walked toward the bedroom. I'm done with this conversation. Lydia stood behind him. Brian, he stopped. If you continue like this, you're going to lose me. He turned around. For a moment, their eyes met. Brian should have listened. He should have remembered the woman who stood beside him when he had nothing. But instead he said, do whatever you want. Then he walked away. Those 6 words would haunt him later. Do whatever you want. The final breaking point came on a Friday evening. Lydia had prepared dinner. She had even bought a small cake because she wanted to surprise Brian. She thought perhaps they could start again. Perhaps he would remember who they used to be. At around 10 o'clock, she heard a car outside. She smiled. Brian is home. When the door opened, her smile disappeared. Brian wasn't alone. A woman walked in with him. Lydia froze. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Brian looked at Lydia. The woman looked around the house. Then Brian said casually, "She's a friend." Lydia stared at him. "A friend?" "Yes. You brought her here," Brian shrugged. "What's the problem?" Lydia looked at the wedding photograph hanging on the wall, then she looked back at Brian. Her voice was calm, too calm. "Brian, take her somewhere else." "Why, this is our home." Brian laughed. "Our home?" "Yes." He looked at the woman beside him, then back at Lydia. "Don't make a scene." Lydia's eyes filled with tears, but this time she refused to cry in front of him. She walked toward the bedroom. She opened the wardrobe. She took out a small suitcase. Brian watched her. "What are you doing?" "Leaving." "Are you going?" "Somewhere I can breathe." Brian shook his head. "You're being dramatic." Lydia stopped packing. She looked at him for what might have been the last time as his wife. "No, Brian," she wiped her tears. "I've been patient. I've forgiven you. I've waited for you. I've defended you. I've prayed for you. But I cannot keep destroying myself just to keep a marriage alive by myself." Brian said nothing. Lydia closed the suitcase. Then she walked out. The following Monday, Lydia visited a lawyer. She didn't tell Brian immediately. She simply said, "I want a divorce." Brian initially thought she was bluffing. "You'll come back." She didn't. Days passed, then weeks. The divorce proceedings began. Brian's friends told him not to worry. "She'll change her mind. She loves you. Come back." Lydia didn't. She had finally understood something important. Love does not mean accepting endless disrespect. When the divorce was finalized, Lydia walked out of the courtroom with tears in her eyes. Not tears of defeat, tears of relief. She had lost a marriage. But she had found herself again. Brian returned to his apartment that evening. For the first time, the house felt enormous. The silence was unbearable. There was no Lydia, no breakfast waiting in the morning, no one asking if he had arrived safely, no one reminding him to take an umbrella, no one waiting at the window. Brian walked into the kitchen. He saw an old cup Lydia used every morning. He opened a drawer. Inside was a handwritten shopping list, her handwriting. He sat down. For the first time in years, Brian felt the weight of what he had done. But by then, Lydia had already begun building a new life. She moved into a small house. She started planning the business she had always dreamed about, a grocery shop. She had no idea that this small decision would eventually transform her life completely.
Brian, why you do this to Lydia?